Realism is a crucial aspect of orchestral music production. If your composition is good and your arrangement is beautiful, but the performance of all the individual instruments is not up to scratch, then the outcome is going to be mediocre at best. In the previous module, we saw some of the most common articulations for all the different sections. This is where the compositional aspect and the music production aspect really overlap the most. The articulation is how you perform a certain note on an instrument. Staccato means detached. Each note is separated from the next one. Legato means bound together. Each note flows into the next one. If you were composing with notation, you would include this information in the score via a series of signs and words that would tell the player how to perform each note. In the context of music production, the articulations are separate patches within a sampler. Most software companies will sample each note for each instrument, played in many different ways, and you'll see that some of the articulations are a standard that you find in most sample libraries, but you'll also see some differences between one sample library and the next one. So not only you need to learn the different articulations for each instrument in theory, but you need to dissect the sample libraries that are available to you and learn how the different patches behave so that you can put them to good use in your productions. I'm going to walk you through some of the main articulations for the different instruments, with the objective of showing you how you can use them in order to program or perform realistic instrument tracks. Some of the concepts that I'm about to illustrate only apply to certain instrument families, whereas other concepts apply to more than one section. On-screen captions will tell you which is which. Staccato patches are a good starting point for short notes. But you can also use spiccato, which is a technique where the bow bounces off the strings, resulting in a lighter sound. For long notes, you can use sustain patches, or legato patches. The main difference is that sustain patches are always polyphonic regardless of the library, and they tend to have a beautiful, lush sound, but they don't allow you to perform a melody where the notes are truly linked together with each sound flowing into the next one. So they tend to work best for supporting parts rather than main parts. If you overlap the notes a bit, if you put some reverb, and overall you have other instruments leading the track at that particular moment, then sustain might be an option. Legato, on the other hand, can be either monophonic or polyphonic. It allows you to recreate an individual melody more accurately because each note flows into the next one, and it's ideal for melodies that are more exposed, but it can be used for supporting parts too. You need to use your judgment here. Portamento is a slide between two notes. And you can use it sparingly to replace some of the legato transitions in order to add more expressiveness and realism. For example, think about the cello melody we just played. It goes A, B, C, A, E. Now if you want this to sound as if it was played entirely on the G string of the cello, which is an entirely plausible scenario, the hand would have to slide in order to get that E note at the end. Therefore, I'm going to use a legato patch for the first part of the melody and then switch to portamento before the last note. It's a small difference, and I don't want you to overthink these things too much. But for melodies that are really exposed, it can be important to work on details like this. Which also poses the question, how do you alternate between articulations? It varies depending on the sample library that you're using. Some libraries use key switches or other forms of MIDI automation, allowing you to change the articulation back and forth very quickly. Some composers don't like key switches and they'd rather have one instrument track per articulation. Both approaches are valid, and I suggest that you try them both, assuming that your samples support key switching. Keeping different articulations on separate tracks might give you more flexibility for mixing later on. Having them on the same track, therefore using key switches, could make it easier to program or perform a convincing line. Sometimes key switches are necessary. Case in point, the previous cello example where you need to alternate seamlessly between legato and portamento. Therefore, you have to manage both articulations from the same instrument track. Either way, you have to be able to utilize multiple articulations for every instrument. In a really common scenario, you're alternating short and long notes. Take this flute line, for example. Aside from the choice of articulations, a few parameters will shape the performance of a virtual instrument. The velocity is the force with which a note is played. It's not just the volume. Most libraries have sampled different layers of intensity for each note of each articulation. So by picking a different velocity, you're actually selecting a sample that was played at a different intensity on the instrument. If you're using a MIDI keyboard, the velocity of each note will depend on how hard you hit the keys. If you're programming the track with your mouse instead, after entering a new note into your piano roll, you open up the controller lane and set the velocity manually. Check your DAW's instruction if you're unsure how to access and edit the velocity lane. For all the short note samples, such as staccato, pizzicato, spiccato, and for some of the long note samples, the velocity is going to be the main dynamic parameter to pay attention to. Velocity is super important for three reasons. It gives you a lot of tonal control. Quiet notes and loud notes have a different tone on many instruments, and all the nuances in between. They all come in handy. It allows you to create lines that have a clear direction. So picture the line in your head, imagine how it would be played by a real section, and try to reproduce it with your samples. It's a great humanization feature because in real life you'd never have two notes that are played with the exact same intensity. So if your MIDI has short notes that are playing at the exact same velocity level all the time, the result is gonna sound dull and definitely not realistic. Dynamic crossfade or velocity crossfade, check out if your virtual instruments use a different name for this, is the main dynamic parameter for long notes, such as sustain, tremolo, legato. In some libraries, it's already mapped to your MIDI controller's mod wheel, but it's usually customizable and you can assign it to any fader via MIDI CC. This parameter allows you to crossfade between the different dynamic layers that the software company recorded for each long note, recreating the dynamics of a real performance as closely as possible. For long notes, the actual regular velocity is not going to be doing anything, so it doesn't matter how hard you hit the keys on your MIDI controller or the velocity value in your MIDI editor. If you're performing your lines on a MIDI controller, you're going to manage the dynamics via the mod wheel or a fader of your choice. If you're programming your track with your mouse instead, you're going to have to open up the MIDI CC1 editor lane unless your dynamic crossfade is assigned to a different MIDI CC value and draw the line manually. Some libraries also allow you to set the dynamic range of the instrument, i.e. the range within which your dynamic crossfade operates. If you set a small range, your quiet parts won't be super quiet, and your loud parts won't be super loud, but your mod wheel will feel more accurate. If you set a broad range, you'll be able to go from super quiet to super loud, but a small variation in the positioning of the mod wheel will produce a bigger change in the sound. Also, some libraries give you an additional parameters called expression or something like that, to be used in conjunction with the dynamic crossfade in order to fine-tune the dynamics of the track. Similarly to what we saw for the velocity in regard to the short notes, dynamic crossfade is really important for long notes for three reasons. Tonal control. Of course, the different levels of intensity will produce different tones. It allows you to shape tracks that sound intentional and with a clear direction. It's a great humanization feature, and if you don't take advantage of it, your parts will sound static and not realistic. With some samples, you might notice that even the lowest dynamics are still quite present. This is perfectly normal, especially for woodwinds and brass, because there's a minimum amount of air that must flow through the instrument in order to generate sound. With the strings, however, if you've already faded to the lowest possible dynamic level and the sound is still there, but you want to make it disappear completely, you can do a volume automation. You can also do it for sustained percussion patches such as rolls sometimes, but only if absolutely necessary, and you have to do it very carefully. The starting points, regardless of the instrument, should be a soft sample that is already at a low dynamic. If you fade from a sample that was recorded with high intensity on the instrument, the sound will retain the tonal quality of a loud sample just played at a lower volume. Having all the notes perfectly aligned to a grid does not help with the realism. So, if you're performing parts on a MIDI keyboard, my advice is that you should perform them on a metronome without quantizing them afterwards. If a few notes are out of time, you can just edit those. On the other hand, if you're programming your tracks with a mouse, you might want to add some humanization by moving some of the notes only slightly away from the grid. Use your taste, make some notes slightly early and some other notes slightly late. This is particularly important for melodic parts that need to convey a lot of emotion. Think of a lead string melody, for example. You don't want that to be robotically accurate. With aggressive tracks that have a lot of percussion and fast notes, a certain level of accuracy is required. Ideally, I wouldn't make those perfectly aligned to the grid either, but you'll have to use your judgment as to what feels accurate enough and decide whether you want to quantize everything or just certain instruments. For example, you could have a super tight rhythmic section with a loose melody on top. Of course, the melody has to be played on time, but it doesn't have to be perfectly aligned to the grid. Not every note of it, at least. Some composers love to use a MIDI keyboard. It can be a MIDI controller, one of those that have no sound of their own and are only used to control a virtual instrument or an outboard synth. But it can also be any keyboard with a suitable MIDI or USB port as long as the DAW can see it. Some other composers prefer to just use their mouse and computer's keyboard, entering by hand all the information that their DAW will need in order to create a realistic rendition of the part. Both methods are valid, with different pros and cons. Feel free to pick the one that feels right for you, and don't forget that you can change at any time. Also, you can use both techniques side by side. Let's have a look at both. The advantage of using a MIDI keyboard is that whenever we record a line, there are small imperfections. The velocities of the short notes are uneven, the tempo can be slightly imperfect, so the track is already humanized, or at least it's reasonably good, and it will become even more realistic with a few tweaks. Also, for long notes, you can perform the dynamics on the mod wheel with your left hand whilst you're playing the notes with your right hand, and this can be a great way to track a lot of MIDI in a short amount of time. Additionally, you can use key switches on the go with your left hand, which means that your performance can potentially incorporate multiple articulations and be as close as possible to the end result. Overall, with a keyboard you can hear what you're doing in real time and pour your soul into each instrument track, building the orchestra one line at a time. MIDI controllers come in different sizes and at different price ranges. The sturdy ones with 88 keys can be pricey. They take some space in your studio but will work across the whole range of the orchestra, including the key switches that can be located anywhere on the keyboard depending on the virtual instrument in question. There are options with a range of just a few octaves that can be really affordable. They don't have the same flexibility and will force you to come up with workarounds, but they can be worth a shot in absence for a better alternative. Among the downsides, using a MIDI keyboard might lead you to stick to a limited number of articulations just because too much key switching is distracting. Using fewer articulations is not necessarily a bad thing as long as the end result sounds convincing. But sometimes you'll want to break down the performance into multiple chunks and manage the articulations separately. You can also tweak the articulations after that you have recorded the line, or even pre-record a track with just the articulation changes. And then record on top of it without having to worry about the key switches. Lastly, depending on your setup, CPU, drivers, and project settings, you might experience latency issues with your MIDI keyboard. If your playback is delayed, then your accuracy will be affected, but there are always tweaks that you can make to improve the playback, such as making sure that you have good drivers for your sound card and setting a smaller buffer size for tracking. You can always go back to a larger buffer size for mixing to take a bit of pressure off the CPU. The main advantage with programming your tracks one note at a time via the MIDI editor is that you don't have to worry about the performance or latency issues. You can program things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to play on a keyboard, and you can pick as many articulations as you want because you don't have to perform the key switching either. On the other hand, you'll have to enter all the humanization manually, the small inaccuracy, the swinging velocities, the dynamic crossfade. Plus, it's always a two-step process. You enter the notes, then you play them back and listen, then go back to do some tweaks, then listen again. Some people prefer one method, some the other one. Either way, it's important that you experiment with both if you can and find what works for you. As I said, a combination of both approaches is also possible. You can perform a line and then tweak some of the velocities or the dynamic crossfade afterwards to make it sound even more realistic. The sustain pedal in the context of orchestral production has three main uses. It can be used to glue lines together. Here, I'm using the pedal to free up my right hand whilst the first chord keeps going thanks to the pedal, which does the same as having the keys still down. Then I get ready to play the second chord and release the sustain pedal just after that I started playing the second chord. It can be used for key switching. Here, I'm using it to activate the motor of a vibraphone, which is very convenient because you might need both hands to play the vibraphone, so I'd rather map the motor switch to the sustain pedal than to the mod wheel. It can of course be used for piano samples, in which case you're going to be using it exactly as you would use it on a real piano. If you're programming your tracks from the piano roll instead of using a MIDI keyboard, or if you have a keyboard but you don't have the sustain pedal, don't forget to tweak this parameter manually. You want to release the pedal more or less every time that there's a chord change, or else the sound will build up too much. Ideally, the pedal release should be covered by a longer note unless you want it to be heard. One thing that you want to consider in regard to the programming of wind instrument is that all musical phrases should account for the gaps that musicians need in order to breathe. Yes, circular breathing is a thing, and it's more common on certain wind instruments, but you shouldn't give it for granted in the context of orchestral composition. Also, thinking about these gaps will help you imagine how you would play the part yourself. So, instead of doing this, you can do this. You can almost hear the player breathing during those little gaps. Make sure that those gaps sound intentional and musical. A couple of extra things that are worth considering in regard to bowed string instruments. Not all pizzicato lines are made equal. String players can quickly switch between arco and pizzicato if it's just for a couple of notes. For extended pizzicato passages, however, they're gonna change the positioning of the hand, so you might want to leave a few seconds gap between bowed notes and pizzicato, then a few seconds again when they need to switch back to arco. Remember the previous module when we talked about divisi strings? Well, divisi is not the only way to write more than one line on a stave for the string section. A bowed string instrument is capable of playing double stops, triple stops, and quadruple stops. A quick look at double stops. On the violin, based on the fact that the open strings are G, D, A, and E, you can have 4 types of double stops. So something like this is entirely playable and you won't need divisi for it. For long notes, for passages without fast melodies, where you also don't need to manage the vibrato individually, you may as well use double stops. For fast passages, or whenever you need a lot of control over the individual lines, of course, divisi are preferable, even if you're writing something that could be played with double stops. In real life, double stops and divisi are different solutions that produce different tones. Let's see how you should approach this from the perspective of someone who's using virtual instruments instead. Let's say that you only have one first violins patch available, which may be called orchestral violins and consists of 14 violins. It's just an example, they could be more, they could be less. If you're using short samples and the part has 2 lines, you can conceive this as double stops, provided that the part is playable, or you can duplicate the track and use divisi. Since you're using the same sample patch, the 2 approaches sound identical. The only difference is that with the second technique, you have more control over the individual lines, both in terms of performance and mixing. But if you don't need that, you can carry on writing 2 lines on one track, even though some of the double stops you come up with are impossible to play. From the production standpoint, in this particular case, the difference is negligible. Now, let's say that you have a sample library that lets you manage divisi strings within the user interface. Or, more common, let's say that you have several violin sample patches. So, alongside the 14 orchestral violins, you also have 6 chamber violins, possibly from the same company so that they don't sound too different. In this case, you can create 3 tracks for the first violins. 1 14 violins tracks for when the first violins are playing in unison, whether it's single or double stops. 2 6 violins tracks, which will be called first violins divisi A and first violins divisi B, for all the divisi parts. If you don't want to do this, or if you don't like how the different samples blend together, you can simply duplicate the 14 orchestral first violins and make something like this. Marcato is an interesting technique. It's a sustained note with a pronounced attack. As you can hear, the attack here is more pronounced than a regular sustain note, but less pronounced than a sforzato. Some libraries feature Marcato patches for most instruments, some other libraries don't. You can, however, always make your own DIY Marcato. Take a sustained patch and play a melody. Now duplicate the track and for the second track pick a short articulation. Put them together and tweak the velocity of the short samples until you get the sound you want. The difference is subtle, but it allows you to accentuate certain notes and can be very useful. Some factory Marcato presets are both velocity sensitive and respond to dynamic crossfade as well. In other words, the velocity is responsible for the intensity of the attack, whereas the dynamic crossfade controls the sustain part of the note. Obviously, when you make your own DIY Marcato, you have maximum control over both parameters, because you are in fact using two articulations, a long one and a short one, running them in parallel. One thing that I want you to consider is that the dynamics you set when programming an instrument have an impact on the tune as a whole. The dynamics of the entire track are the result of all the individual velocities and dynamic crossfades of the single instruments put together. This, in turn, has an impact on the mix later on, so it's not just realism that we are talking about. This is not to say that you should refrain from using a wide dynamic range for your instruments. You just need to be deliberate about it. If you have a horn ensemble that is playing a main melody, you want to start by performing it with the right intensity. If you're using the string section to make a bed that will support a lead instrument, you want to make sure that the dynamics of the strings are not overwhelming. By paying attention to these aspects at the programming stage, you will achieve realism and you'll get to the end of the arrangement phase with something that sounds reasonably balanced already. And this is going to make your life a lot easier at the mixing stage. Super loud dynamics on instruments that have a lot of energy in the low end will most likely clog up your lows. So controlling the lows is something that definitely begins at the arrangement programming stage and continues at the mixing mastering stage. What aspects of a sample library make it more or less ideal for when you are trying to render a realistic instrument performance? The selection of articulations is definitely a factor. You want to make sure that all the basics are covered for the strings: staccato, legato, sustain, pizzicato, tremolo, portamento, detache, possibly different types of staccato, long and short, and detache, long and short. For the winds, staccato, sustain, legato, and portato. For the percussion, you want to make sure that some rolls with dynamic crossfade are included along with the single hits. You will find all this info in the product description. The quality of the legato transitions is another crucial aspect, and this is something you can try firsthand if the company offers demo licenses, or you can look for walkthroughs on YouTube. How many dynamic layers have been sampled for each note? The more the better, both for long and short notes. Round robin is the number of samples for each note at a set dynamic level. That means that if you repeat the note with the same intensity, the sampler is gonna pick a different sample. This helps avoid the machine gun-like effect on the repeated notes. The round robin can be 2, 4, or more. In addition to round robin, some libraries have built-in humanization features. In other words, they allow you to use and modify patterns of intonation curves. To further humanize the performance by adding more variety to the intonation of each individual note, so that you won't have two notes that sound the same. Useful for repeated notes, you won't be using this all the time, every time, but it might come in handy. Time stretch is another useful feature. Some sample libraries allow you to modify the length of a sample. This might help if you want to lengthen or shorten a staccato patch, for example. Or if you have repeated note samples like this, and you need to modify them so that they fit the tempo of your track. Ideally, having some control over the amount of vibrato would be great too. Your long samples should have at least two versions, one with less vibrato and one with more. The microphones are also important. Most libraries these days offer a combination of close and distant microphones, and that helps achieve a nice organic sound. The budget is entirely up to you. If you keep in mind the suggestions I gave you, you should be able to locate the best possible library for the budget that you set. Whatever your samples are, it is important that you know them inside out and that you're aware of their limitations. Orchestral samples these days are really good. They sound great out of the box and almost allow you to program anything you may come up with. However, they always have limitations compared to real instruments, or we should say they have different limitations than real instruments, because you might program something that is impossible to play with real instruments. But that's a different story. My point here is that you should really study your samples and know their strengths so that you can put them to good use. You should also know their weaknesses and try to hide them. To summarize this module, know the different articulations and what they do. Know your sample libraries and how to switch between the articulations. Decide whether you're going to be using a keyboard, your piano roll, or both. Learn how parameters such as velocity and dynamic crossfade influence the sound. Make sure that each individual line sounds intentional and convincing. Learn how the positioning of the notes in relation to the grid affects the realism. Quantized things sound more robotic. A little randomness sounds more human. Familiarize with MIDI CC and use it to fine-tune your instrument performances. Don't forget that those who play wind instruments need to breathe. Be deliberate about your dynamics because they affect realism but also have an impact on the overall balance of the track.